On a Tuesday morning in October, a $400,000 John Deere 8R sat dead in the middle of a half-cut cornfield in central Iowa. The engine turned over and the fuel tank was full, but nothing was physically broken on the machine. There wasn't a snap belt, a spun bearing, or a leaking seal to be found anywhere. The machine was simply locked because a software fault had tripped the ECU and the computer had forced the tractor into limp mode. It wouldn't move an inch. The dealer was 4 hours away, and the tech rep was sitting at a laptop somewhere else entirely, pulling up diagnostics through a remote connection. Meanwhile, the corn was standing in the field with a rain system coming in 36 hours. Now let me ask you something. Can a man with a piece of copper wire and 50 years of mechanical sense beat a machine a corporation built to be unbeatable? Let me tell you about the machine because you need to understand what Dale Hutchins actually bought before you can understand what happened to him. The John Deere 8R is not a simple piece of iron. It carries somewhere between 30 and 50 individual computers, depending on how it's configured, and all of them talk to each other over a CAN bus network. That's just a two-wire system that lets the computers share data without running a separate wire to every single component on the frame. On top of that, you have GPS guidance, telematics, and a software layer that connects the machine directly to the dealer's service advisor system. The tractor can actually report its own fault codes to the dealership before Dale even climbs down from the cab. The salesman called that efficiency, but in the real world, it's just another way to lose control of your own tools. Dale is in his mid-40s and is a third-generation corn and soybean farmer in central Iowa. His grandfather broke this ground, and his father expanded it, but Dale runs the operation now. He manages about 1,800 acres on margins so tight that a bad week doesn't just hurt his wallet. It compounds into a disaster. He bought the 8R because the numbers made sense on paper, promising more acres per hour and less fuel per acre. The salesman was right about the efficiency, but he didn't mention the part where the machine owns the farmer. Now, Dale isn't a complainer. He's a watcher and a planner who keeps a whiteboard in his shop with the harvest schedule broken down by field and by day. He knows what the weather window looks like 2 weeks out, and he knows exactly what a day of downtime cost him in October. He doesn't run his operation on the assumption that losing time is acceptable. But the new steel doesn't care about his schedule. 3 weeks before the tractor died, the 8R had thrown a fault code. The dealer said it was just something in the hydraulic pressure sensor circuit, so they pulled it up remotely and cleared it. They told Dale the sensor had probably just read a spike and the system had overcorrected, which meant there was nothing to worry about. Dale wrote the incident on his whiteboard and kept going. But here is what he found out the hard way. A fault that gets cleared without getting fixed doesn't go away. It waits. The sensor was still reading wrong, and the ECU was still watching it. And 3 weeks later, the computer finally ran out of patience. The dash lit up red while the corn was standing ripe, and a rain system was moving in from the northwest. The machine dropped to 30% power, the hydraulics locked out, and Dale's harvest schedule stopped making any sense at all. Let me tell you about limp mode, because the name makes it sound a lot gentler than it actually is. When the ECU detects a fault it can't verify as safe, the computer doesn't just shut the machine down, but instead it throttles the engine back to 30% and locks out the hydraulics. It holds the tractor in that state until an authorized technician with the right software arrives to tell it otherwise. John Deere calls this a protective feature, and in a narrow sense, that might be true, since a computer is just guarding against a fault It isn't programmed to diagnose. But you have to understand that the software isn't protecting Dale. It is protecting the company's liability profile, and there is a massive difference between those two things. After Dale climbed down from the cab, he called the dealership to explain the error code, the timing of the breakdown, and the rain that was showing up on the radar. The service manager sounded sympathetic, but the earliest they could get a technician on site was 2 days away because harvest season was in full swing and every other farmer in the county was having problems of their own. 2 days was a lifetime in this weather. So Dale looked at his phone and realized the heavy rain was scheduled to hit his fields in just 36 hours. The dealer offered to connect him with a tech rep who could run remote diagnostics through the machine's telematics system, and Dale agreed just to see if it would help. Within the hour, a rep called and pulled up the 8R on a laptop from some office far away, walking Dale through exactly what the sensors were reporting. The hydraulic pressure sensor circuit was throwing an active fault, which meant the ECU had flagged the system and locked the entire machine until a manual reset could be performed. When Dale asked if he could clear the code himself, the answer was a flat no. The reset required a full function version of Service Advisor, a tool that is strictly for dealer access only. Dale then asked if he could simply buy the software or download it from a site, but the rep explained that Service Advisor is proprietary property that John Deere only distributes to its own authorized shops. It isn't available for purchase by independent mechanics, and the farmer who actually owns the machine cannot buy the tool required to unlock it. That isn't an oversight in the design, but rather a deliberate company policy. The tech rep kept talking, explaining the intricacies of the fault codes in the careful language of someone reading from a screen, but Dale stopped listening somewhere around the third paragraph. He already understood the reality of his situation, which was that he'd paid $400,000 for a machine that answered to someone else the moment things got difficult. Standing there in the dirt, he started doing the math on what a day of downtime during peak harvest actually costs on an 1,800-acre operation. A delay like this isn't just a lost day, but a loss of yield that gets left in the field if the weather window slams shut before the work is finished. Depending on what the rain does, the corn either gets too dry or too wet, and that loss compounds just like high-interest debt does, quietly and without any mercy. 2 days of waiting wasn't just a minor inconvenience, but a situation where a significant portion of his yearly margin was potentially disappearing into the mud. The tech rep eventually asked if Dale wanted to schedule the service visit for Thursday, but Dale just said he'd have to call him back. He stood there between the rows while the 8R idled low behind him, the dashboard still glowing a bright, angry red through the cab window. The corn on both sides of him was ready for the bin, and if the wind moved just right, you could hear that dry, papery rattle of stalks that have given everything they have to give. That's when he heard the sound of a truck turning off the blacktop and onto his gravel field road. It was an old Chevy moving slow, the way old trucks do when the driver isn't in any particular hurry, because a man who has already figured most things out doesn't feel the need to rush. Robert Hale is 74 years old and farms 200 acres just 2 miles down the road, working the same ground his family has owned since the 1950s. He does his work with equipment that was built before most of Dale's hired hands were even born, and he doesn't use telematics or GPS guidance to get the job done. Instead, he relies on a good eye and a feel for the ground that took him decades to develop, possessing the kind of patience that only comes from farming through enough bad years to stop being surprised by them. Let me tell you about Robert, because you really need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. He grew up in a time when fixing a machine meant tracing a problem back to where the movement stopped and figuring out the why with your own hands and eyes. There were no fault codes or laptops involved, and there certainly wasn't a tech rep on the other end of a phone line to give you permission to work. You followed the electrical circuit, you tested the physical component, and you found the break in the system. That isn't a skill you can just read about in a manual, but a habit you build over 50 years of being the only person available when a tractor quits in the middle of a section. Robert pulled his truck up alongside the massive 8R and climbed out of the cab without any sense of urgency. He looked the machine over the way an older man looks at something he's trying to place, appearing neither impressed nor dismissive, but simply reading the steel. He walked around the tractor one time, pausing to look at the error code glowing on the dash through the glass of the cab. Then he turned toward Dale and asked a single, simple question. Does the engine actually run? Dale told him that it would idle just fine, but the computer wouldn't let it move under a load or allow the hydraulics to cycle. Robert just nodded his head like that was exactly the answer he had expected to hear. Now let me pause here because you need to understand Robert's mechanical worldview to see why this worked. He doesn't see a computer-controlled tractor as something fundamentally different from the old iron he grew up with, but rather as the same machine with a few more unnecessary steps between the switch and the part. The computer still has to tell something physical to move, whether that is a solenoid, a relay, or a valve. If the computer refuses to send that signal, the question isn't how you talk to the software, but where the physical component is located and whether you can reach it with a tool. That is a much simpler problem to solve, and he explained his plan to Dale in about 4 sentences. As part of the limp mode lockout, the ECU was holding the fuel shutoff solenoid in a restricted state to keep the tractor from working. The job of that solenoid is basic. It opens up to let the engine run at full capacity, and it closes down to cut the fuel off entirely. In limp mode, the computer keeps that valve partially closed and won't release it without a dealer reset. But the solenoid itself is just an electromagnet sitting on a spring. If you feed that magnet 12 volts of power directly, it will open up, and it won't bother to ask who sent the electricity. Robert walked back to his truck and returned with a short length of 12-gauge copper wire, maybe 8 inches long, with both ends stripped bare. Dale just looked at the wire, unsure of what was about to happen. Robert didn't say much. He just looked at the tractor and told Dale to show him where the wiring harness ran. The wiring harness on an 8R runs along the frame rail before it ducts through a conduit toward the engine bay. Robert found what he was looking for the way an older man finds most things, which is to say he wasn't really searching so much as he just knew where to look. He traced the line with 2 fingers, following that bundle of wires until he reached the solenoid housing. It was a small metal cylinder bolted to the fuel system, about the size of a salt shaker, with 2 electrical terminals sitting right on top. He crouched down and watched the machine for a long minute without touching a single thing. "Hand me that test light," Robert said, looking up at Dale. Dale reached into the side pocket of the cab and pulled out a cheap one, just a plastic handle with a probe on one end and an alligator clip on the other. Robert clipped the lead to a ground point on the frame, touched the first terminal, and saw no light. He moved to the second terminal and found the same result. The ECU wasn't sending a signal because it had gone quiet on purpose. Robert stood up, waiting a second for his knees to cooperate, and held up that short piece of copper wire. Now let me tell you about the mechanic's logic here, because you need to understand the physics of what was happening. The CAN bus network in a tractor like this is always talking, sending messages back and forth between computers to tell parts like solenoids and valves what to do. Normally, the engine computer sends a run signal, the solenoid gets its voltage, a magnetic coil pulls a plunger, and the fuel starts flowing. When the machine hits limp mode, the computer simply stops sending that signal. The solenoid stays shut, the fuel stays choked, and the tractor stays weak. But here is the thing about that solenoid. It doesn't know it's being ignored. It isn't listening to the network, and it isn't running any software. It is nothing more than a coil of wire wrapped around a metal core, and when you hit it with 12 volts, it does exactly what it was built to do. The computer is the gatekeeper, but the solenoid is just the gate. Robert found the positive terminal, spotted a 12-volt source at a relay block nearby, and bridged them together with his wire. It was a direct connection, with no computer standing in the middle. "Try the throttle," Robert called out. Dale climbed back into the seat and pushed the lever forward. The engine didn't exactly roar to life the way a healthy machine does, but it started climbing in RPMs with a cautious, stiff rhythm. The hydraulic pressure gauge began to tick upward. Even though the warning lights were still screaming and the dash was full of red text, the machine was finally moving under its own power. It wasn't at full strength, and it probably wouldn't have handled a heavy corn head and thick stalks, but it was enough to get the job done. Dale sat there in the cab for a few seconds, just listening to the engine run. The tech rep was still sitting on hold on Dale's phone, which was resting on the seat right next to him. Dale picked up the phone and ended the call. "Now, before you go thinking this is a fix for everything," Robert stopped Dale before he drove off to make two things very clear. He explained that this bypass only worked because the problem was a line sensor, not a real mechanical failure in the hydraulics. If you jump a solenoid on a machine that actually has a failing pump or a cracked line, you are just hiding a fire until it burns the whole house down. He also knew exactly which wire to touch because he'd spent an hour reading the machine's behavior before he ever reached for a tool. This wasn't a guess. It was a diagnosis done without a laptop. There is a version of this story where Robert's wire causes a massive electrical short, and he knew that risk existed. He made a judgment call based on 50 years of watching how iron behaves, and that isn't a method you should copy unless you have that same foundation under your boots. But on that Tuesday morning in October, with the rain moving in on that specific field, his judgment turned out to be right. Dale put the tractor in gear and headed back into the standing corn. He kept that machine running for the next 14 hours straight. Dale managed to get his corn out of the field, but you have to look past that one farm to see the bigger picture. What happened to him isn't an isolated mistake. It's the new pattern of doing business. John Deere has a tool called Service Advisor that can reset software locks and clear out these active faults. But they only give it to authorized dealers. They don't sell it to independent mechanics, they don't give it to farm co-ops, and they certainly don't give it to the people who actually buy the tractors. The company says this is about safety and quality control, and there might be a small grain of truth in that. But the real truth is that it protects a massive stream of repair money. When a $400,000 machine can only be fixed by one company, it stops being a piece of equipment and starts being a subscription service. In January of 2025, the Federal Trade Commission decided they'd seen enough and filed a lawsuit against Deere in a Chicago federal court. Several states like Illinois and Minnesota joined in because the core of the problem was pretty simple. The government is alleging that Deere holds a monopoly over the repair of its own machines, using that power to force farmers into dealer shops where they have to pay dealer prices on dealer timelines. The FTC argued that this control leads to higher costs and lost crops because a corporation owns the digital keys to the equipment the farmer already paid for. A federal judge looked at the evidence in October of 2024 and refused to throw the case out, calling the proof of market control substantial. Deere has stayed consistent with their defense, claiming that most repairs are still available to the owners and that these locks protect the complicated systems. Back in 2023, they signed a deal with the American Farm Bureau to give farmers more manuals and some basic data. The Farm Bureau called it progress, and maybe it was, but it was a very small step in a long race. That agreement kept the real diagnostic tools locked up tight at the dealership. It was like opening the screen door while leaving the deadbolt turned on the main entrance. That was the reality Dale was facing when his dashboard turned red. He owned that tractor on paper, and he paid every cent of the bill, but he couldn't fix it himself. He couldn't even hire a neighbor to fix it because the tools were off limits. The machine had an owner in the field and a landlord in a server farm in Illinois, and that landlord was the only one allowed to turn the digital wrench. Now, some folks will tell you that this is just how modern technology works. They'll say these machines are too complex for a farmer to be poking around in a computer network. And Robert would actually agree with some of that. If you jump the wrong wire without knowing the system, you can turn a small problem into a pile of scrap metal very quickly. There is a fair argument for keeping some parts of the software protected, but there is a massive gap between protecting the software and locking the owner out of the engine. The FTC lawsuit lives in that gap, and so did Dale's lost morning while the rain clouds were building on the radar. When a corporation decides that you aren't allowed to understand or repair the machine you bought, that isn't a safety measure. That is leverage, plain and simple. Robert's bypass wire only cost about 40 cents in copper. What that wire represented, however, is costing the American farmer a whole lot more. Subscribe to see the underdog win through character and old iron. When Dale finally brought the 8R back into the yard that evening, the corn was out of the field, and the first gray edge of the rain system was already crossing the county line. He shut the big engine down and climbed out of the cab stiff-legged, moving with that slow ache you get after sitting in a seat for 14 hours straight. Robert was still there, leaning against his truck and waiting in the fading light. Robert had stayed through the afternoon because that is just the kind of man he is. He waited until Dale had both feet firm on the ground before he said a word, and then he looked at him and asked what he had actually learned out there today. Dale took a second to think it over, and he started talking about the solenoid, the bypass wire, and the complexities of the CAN bus system. Robert just shook his head once and told him the real truth, which was that Dale had learned he didn't fully own that machine. That is the lesson you need to sit with for a minute, and it has nothing to do with a piece of wire or a specific bypass on a single solenoid. The wire was just the tool, but the real thing Dale carried out of that field was the realization that his machine had a layer of authority built into it that didn't answer to him. He had paid for the steel, the engine, the hydraulics, and the GPS antenna. Yet somewhere inside all that new iron, there was a switch the manufacturer still controlled. On the wrong Tuesday morning, they could flip that switch without even meaning to, leaving a $400,000 investment sitting dead in a half-cut field while the clouds built up on the horizon. The lesson Robert offers here isn't that you should go around bypassing your safety systems, but rather that you must understand what you own deeply enough that no software layer can ever make you helpless. Men of his generation learned how a machine worked by taking it apart and following the circuits until they found the break. They spent their lives asking what every single component actually did, and what would happen to the whole system if that one part stopped working. That habit of tracing every complex system back to its simplest physical form isn't just nostalgia for the old days. It is still the most useful thing a farmer can bring into a field, because while the machines got more complicated, the physics underneath them never changed. A solenoid is still just a coil of wire. A relay is still just a switch. And voltage still flows in the same direction it always has. The computer acts as a gatekeeper, but the gate is still there, and a man who knows exactly where it is will always have one more option than a man who doesn't. The corn made it into the bin before the rain started falling, and the tech rep from the dealership never did call back. Robert's piece of wire cost about 40 cents. But the knowledge required to use it took 50 years of grease and hard work to build. That gap between what a piece of copper costs and what it takes to understand it is the whole story. Subscribe to see the underdog win through character and old iron.